TR began his presidency with a speech to Congress in December 1901. He declared his support for the industrialists who had built up and maintained the commercial and manufacturing infrastructure of the country. He then added his desire to rid the business world of crimes of cunning as one would rid society of crimes of violence. He would put these beliefs into action by opposing a massive merger in the railway sector in 1902, stunning Wall Street in the process. The largest railway companies in the country had decided to thumb their nose at the president's rhetoric through the creation of a rail monopoly that would cover 32,000 miles of track. The merger, known as the Northern Securities Company, was created by J.P. Morgan, James Hill, and E.H. Harriman, who sought to combine the Burlington Great Northern and Northern Pacific Railroads. TR filed an antitrust suit under the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which had been drained of power and little enforced. Morgan challenged TR by requesting the Attorney General to visit him and settle the dispute. Wall Street at this point was paralyzed by fear and impressed by the boldness of the new president. TR wished to establish dominance over the business tycoons and prove that they were subordinate to the government, not above it. In 1904, the Supreme Court sided with the government and ordered the company to dissolve. TR considered this to be a great victory, and it motivated him to file more antitrust suits throughout his presidency. He would file 40 more suits against various other companies, such as Standard Oil and the Sugar Trust, in the coming years. TR would continue pushing for progressive reform during his first term. He set a precedent for government intervention by assisting in the settlement of a coal workers' strike in 1902 and proposing the establishment of a Department of Commerce and Labor in 1903. This would provoke resistance from his own GOP majority in Congress. The resistance to this level of intervention was so great that it appeared dead in the water. TR overcame this by claiming to the press that J.D. Rockefeller was behind the resistance and then fabricated a series of messages which appeared similar to what had been said by an official from Standard Oil. The outcry was so great that Congress was forced to pass the bill into law and create the department. While gaining reputation as a progressive, TR maintained a socially conservative outlook. He derided the wealthy corporatists who had taken advantage of the poor but considered radicals and anarchists as enemies of the social order. TR believed in an overarching yet benevolent government and had made comments suggesting the country would do a great deal better if ruled by a single person with good intentions. TR had great admiration for the military society of Germany and considered the Bismarckian method of government with its focus on discipline, nationalism, interventionism, and social welfare as a model to emulate. While TR had made gains on the domestic front during his first term, he also had an impact in foreign affairs. He focused primarily on South America for intervention and wished to improve America's standing with the other great world powers such as Britain and Germany. In 1903, Germany had decided to impose a blockade on Venezuela due to its refusal to acknowledge or pay the country's debts. TR had no love for the dictatorship of Venezuela, but nevertheless issued a stern warning to Germany that any aggression against the country would lead to war with the US. The Kaiser backed down almost immediately. TR then shifted his attention to the country of Colombia. He desired to create a canal to link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through Latin America. He instructed his Secretary of State to offer Colombia $10 million in annual payments for a strip of land in the northern part of the country. He also asked Congress to pay a French company $40 million for rights to the route. Congress approved of the deal, but it was rejected by the Colombian government. The government claimed that the amount paid to them was too low, and they requested a portion of the money set aside for the French. TR was infuriated at this decision and proposed to Congress that the U.S. should simply seize the land without any further consent from the Colombians. During these negotiations, nationalists in the disputed region of Colombia, known as Panama, revolted and declared secession from the country. The rebellion was financed by an agent of the French company mentioned previously and a self-interested lawyer from Manhattan under the assumption that TR would approve. TR sent a naval ship to the area shortly before the rebellion to prevent the landing of any armed force, government, or insurrectionist. This violated a series of treaties and agreements set with the Colombian government. With haste, TR recognized the new country of Panama and signed an agreement with them which gave the U.S. a much larger area to dig the canal. The Panamanians were reluctant to accept the deal but had no other options left to them. The Panama Canal was regarded by TR as his greatest achievement. He was raked by the press, who accused him of assaulting another republic over the wreckage of international law. TR ignored these criticisms and even made the journey to the canal zone to take photographs of himself operating a steam shovel. He would continue to defend the decision until his death and considered his actions to be in line with international morality. This event highly demonstrated TR's view of the scope of government power and the friction between Congress and the executive. TR claimed to have bypassed the debate in Congress by acting to seize the canal and inviting Congress to debate him, not the action. TR would have another international controversy before the end of his first term. In 1904, he had learned that a former citizen of New Jersey had been kidnapped in Morocco and was being held ransom. TR, taking this as an insult to the U.S., promptly sent 7 warships and multiple companies of Marines to Morocco to put pressure on the Sultan to pay the ransom and track down the kidnappers. It was later revealed that the victim was not an American citizen and had traded his U.S. passport for her Greek one. TR refused to believe he had been mistaken and continued on this course until the Sultan eventually gave in to the demands for the ransom and the captive was sent home. The captive admitted to the newspapers that he was no longer an American citizen. He mentioned that he had received Greek citizenship but had never lived the required 2 years in Athens and said he had not renounced American citizenship. He would later receive a passport as an American citizen. This event directly led to the election of 1904. The RNC delegates approved of the president's tough stance on international affairs and chose him to head the party in the new election. This was the first time a president had been nominated for a second term after coming into office on the death of a predecessor. TR entered the 1904 election with a large bag of cash and a weak opponent. The Democrats had now lost 2 consecutive elections with William Jennings Bryan and nominated Alton B. Parker to head the ticket. Democratic supporters of Grover Cleveland had finally wrestled control back from Bryan's followers and nominated Parker on the second ballot, triumphing over the newspaper tycoon William Randolph Hearst. The 1904 general election was considered to be gentler compared to the 1900 election, which contained a great deal of class conflict and harsh rhetoric. The 2 frontrunners, TR and Parker, were considered to be very close in their political approach. Both men supported the Gold Standard Act adopted by McKinley in 1900. Both candidates believed in fair treatment for the Philippines, and both were for labor rights. Parker attacked TR for his heavy-handed tactics in government, while TR ran on promotion of the Square Deal. The deal was a plan to avoid the decadence and destruction of past republics, which resulted in the rich exploiting the poor, or the poor plundering the rich. The government would act as a mediator between the two sides through consumer protection, control of the economy, and conservation. The election ultimately came down to personality. TR won the election decisively by capturing every state outside the former Confederacy with 336 electoral votes and 56.5% of the popular vote. He had finally stepped out of McKinley's shadow and was ready to take on the office as his own man. TR came into a second term with a singular goal, to discipline the marketplace, which was to much chagrin of elected officials and business titans. He made a speech to Congress in 1905 that outlined his desire to assert the sovereignty of government over corporations. He began by demanding the books of railroad companies be opened for federal review, insisted on deciding rates, wished to intervene in labor disputes, and planned to regulate insurance firms. In 1906, he was successful in expanding the power of the Interstate Commerce Commission over railroad rates. He then took on meatpacking lobbyists and the Beef Trust by ordering a damning report into the practices of slaughterhouses. The findings were so abhorrent that it placed pressure on Congress to pass the regulatory legislation sought by TR. The committee initially balked and dragged its feet until TR promised to not release the report if they passed the legislation. When they continued to refuse, he released some of the report, which had an enormous impact on the reputation of the Beef Trust and public outcry. The negative attention and declining meat sales finally forced Congress to negotiate. The Meat Inspection Act of 1906 was passed and established federal regulation of the industry for the first time. At the same time, TR signed into law the Pure Food and Drug Act, which banned fraudulent labeling of products and medicine. For the continuation of his second term, TR continued to move leftward on the political spectrum while Congress moved to the right. TR continued to attack corporations with federal regulation and came out in support of inheritance and income taxes, workmen's compensation, and limits to labor injunctions. The courts, acting on the opposite, struck down legislation pertaining to workers' rights and protections. The courts argued that these regulations infringed upon a worker's liberty of contract, or the right of a worker to expose themselves to danger if they had freely chosen to be employed in that area. TR argued that it was a moral wrong for a worker to take on the entire responsibility for their safety after having no alternative to employment in unsafe conditions. Financial markets would enter crisis during the Panic of 1907, where the stock market fell by 50% over a 3-week period. The crisis was initiated when an attempt was made to corner the stock of the United Copper Company. The bid failed, and banks who had lent enormous sums of money to the borrowers invested in the attempt experienced runs. This expanded to other banks and trusts across the country and led to a panic. Regional banks began to withdraw money from New York City's banks, followed by customers who withdrew from the regional banks. Blame was placed on TR for his anti-business stance, and he was at a loss for any plan of action. The government had not created the Federal Reserve Bank at this time and relied on an independent treasury to provide federal funding. It was woefully inadequate in its ability to pump money into the economy. TR was forced to approach banking magnate J.P. Morgan, who agreed to pledge money into the banking system along with his associates for certain concessions, namely the permission of the federal government for United Steel to purchase the holdings of a competitor. The crisis was averted, but TR placed blame squarely on the wealthy for the incident and pledged that he would not allow the financial elite to escape government control. TR continued to push progressive reform and made changes to not only the office of the executive, but Washington itself. Many of these plans were halted and challenged by Congress, who were growing more successful at obstructing the president. Congress would not allow him to investigate the harsh inequalities and barbarism directed at African Americans in the South, and would not provide funding for plans to tear down slums in Washington in favor of parks and playgrounds. TR would even go so far as to request a whipping post to be placed for wife beaters. This was denied by Congress. TR found ways around this stonewalling by ordering reports and organizing panels of experts to speak on matters such as public housing and health. He supported rights for children and pensions for single mothers. The idea was to draw public support to such a degree that Congress would be forced to pass legislation for his programs. TR also focused on conservation, a lifelong passion of his. He created a Bureau of Reclamation that would eventually claim an area bigger than Texas to be earmarked for national parks and reserves. He fought for animal rights by placing endangered species like the buffalo in zoos. He created over 50 bird sanctuaries, such as Pelican Island in Florida, the first bird refuge in America. Congress naturally balked at these efforts, which forced TR to invent solutions to circumvent them. He was able to save Inscription Rock in New Mexico and the petrified forest using the Antiquities Act. When Congress refused to make the Grand Canyon a national park, TR declared it to be a national monument and added 800,000 hectares. Finally, in 1907, Congress passed a bill forbidding the creation of any new national forests. TR could not veto the bill due to the funds being indispensable. In a last-ditch effort, he picked out 16 million acres of wood and classified it as a reserve through presidential decree. In 1907, TR's final year in office, relations between Congress and the executive turned ugly. Congress had passed resolutions to reduce the activities of the Secret Service. TR responded by asserting the only reason for this provision was to prevent investigation into Congress itself and compared them to the criminal class. The House voted to reprimand TR as being disrespectful to the legislative branch. Members of Congress would avoid TR for the rest of his days as president. Foreign policy in TR's second term would be much like the first. Regarding Latin America, he continued to enforce the Monroe Doctrine that any intervention by external powers in South America was a hostile act to the U.S. In 1904, he added a second dimension to the rule, the Roosevelt Corollary, which not only warned European powers against intervention, but reserved the right of the U.S. to intervene. TR put this plan into action in countries such as Santo Domingo, which was made a U.S. protectorate in 1904 after the country reneged on its debts to European powers. TR would sign a deal with Santo Domingo to place its custom collection under American supervision in 1905. When Cuba, a U.S. protectorate since 1901, became unruly and chaotic in 1906, TR had no concern sending in Marines to occupy the country without congressional approval. TR had more cordial relations with the other world powers compared to his saber-rattling in South America. Much of the foreign policy during his second term was focused on the Far East. He cultivated friendly negotiations with Japan, which would lend support to the American occupation of the Philippines. He would later use these connections to Japan to hammer out a peace deal in the Russian-Japanese War of 1906, an act that would earn him a Nobel Peace Prize. In one of his last goals as president, he sought to develop the U.S. Navy into a force befit of an emerging world power. He had dreamed of this accomplishment since his time as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1897. TR managed to convince Congress to double the size of the fleet, adding 6 dreadnoughts, which were more powerful than battleships. As a method of demonstrating the power of America, he dispatched a number of American warships to circumnavigate the globe. This was to show other world powers that the Pacific was as much America's home as the Atlantic. The fleet will be welcomed home by TR in 1909, days before his last term as president ended. TR would never again hold the office of president, but his life in politics was by no means over. He would spend the remaining years of his life following his passion for the natural sciences and promoting politics closely associated with his personal beliefs. TR had completed almost 2 full terms as president and created a legacy that would influence all his successors to come.